It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Jane Pell, who's an artist, researcher, commercial diver with a passion for live art, exploration and human movement in space and underwater. So we invited Sarah as the sort of extreme environments aspect of uncertainty. And no sooner had we made contact and I'd invited her to come to this event than I saw this very striking, tall, blonde figure striding across our floor in the new design hub in RMIT. And it turned out it was Sarah working with the Exertion Games Lab who shared the floor with us. So that was a kind of interesting segue. So she's currently the co-chair of the European Space Agency Topical Team Art and Science, visiting researcher at RMIT University, Aegis, part of the Exertion Games Lab and Aegis Research Cluster, fully qualified ADAS commercial diver and a space art astronaut hopeful. Also a TED fellow, so you may have seen Sarah on TED. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you so much for having me here today. I want to talk about depth, and depth really matters. And this particular image that I'm starting with here today has absolutely no architectural elements whatsoever, and it's kind of important. For me, this is an amazing scene. It is what divers are seeing looking underwater at the front light of a newly refurbished submersible, a one-man submersible, which my friend was test piloting in a cold, dark lake in California last year. It was the first sign for the crew that the systems were working, at least the batteries were on. It reminds me that we've grown used to technology for connecting us, protecting us, and perfecting us. We've grown used to the idea of living and working in extreme environments, from underwater to outer space, and the future where interstellar spaceflight, where hybrid virtual actual realities are second nature and cooperations with entirely new forms of intelligent life are commonplace. We see evidence of this every day. In fact, you work with it every day. Given the intense learning curve that we have experienced during our evolution on this planet, it is easy to forget that the journey has only just begun. I like to think that we're in this kind of adolescent phase. We're going through a growth phase. We're consuming everything at a rapid rate. We're highly emotional and reactive. We're searching for any means of escape, a means of communication, to question our kind of bodily changes as we experience the pain and potential that comes through the deep processes of self-discovery and exploration of a world beyond ourselves, of the spaces that we are yet to discover and yet to create, and recklessly searching to identify with who we are and confront the purpose and meaning of our own existence. Now, my dear friend Brent had never test piloted a submersible before. In fact, he had never, ever piloted a submersible before. But he had dreamt of it many times, and he had designed a submersible over and over and over. In fact, he owned the sister model to this particular vehicle, and if he wanted expert support and investment to bring his dream to life, for it to be working and operational, then he needed to take the plunge. He needed to prove himself and to be the pilot of his own research and to be the pilot of his own dreams. Brent sent me this message hours after I knew he had descended with a little quote which said, "It is all just a matter of depth." This resonates with me as both an artist, a researcher, and a diver. As you know, we live in this increasingly stimulation-rich environment comprising of actual and virtual network systems and complex human computing and environment interactions. And yet I return to the ocean over and over again for stimulation. And here, like there in the ocean, there are no rules. There is only art. I invite you to, if you like, step into my shoes for the next half an hour or so, and to free yourself from the obligation of relating or examining or critiquing this body of work that I'm about to present, or indeed imagining a future anew as architects, engineers, programmers, and designers. I invite you to look inside yourself. We are each artists constructing for uncertainty. And in the face of ever-changing extreme environments, I call on you to kind of dive in and be conscious of the depths at which you are operating. And in return, just return, with this experience, to inform the new architects or the artifacts, the architectures, and build healthy, strong, synergistic environments. So I'm inspired by current strategies for human exploration and adaptation in extreme environments, from the sea to space, making use of real-time network design in my own productions and installations, coupled with the direct physical world experience that I base my research upon. For example, technologies preparing us for space are so cool, come on. The NASA fixed and virtual motion simulators, which are shown here, for astronaut training. I was lucky to attend workshops with NASA astronaut Dan Barry and be able to fly the simulations for a number of hours. And the LTEC, or the Italian, developed a virtual reality system for a tour of the International Space Station. This is basically in support of the work for the European Space Agency, using a heads-up display in order to fly through not only space but the space hardware itself, and to start to begin this visualizing process of going deeper and deeper and deeper into a space well beyond that which we can even fathom at this stage. Bringing us back to Earth slightly, the commercial diving supervisor simulation, replicating all aspects of a dive and dive supervision, from compressor chambers to life support systems, with built-in programs for simulating things like diver emergency scenarios for both the supervisors and the participants and those supervising the dive. Now, as a fully qualified commercial diver myself, I can assure you that a simulation is not the same thing as a real experience. There's nothing like actually getting wet, facing the real risks, and learning to develop the kind of personal resourcefulness that you require to be a first responder for your own life. And this obviously has a great impact on the kind of work you create and the kinds of ways in which you create it. So for the most part, as designers of, say, virtual simulations, they're designed to provide these kind of sophisticated training environments, while analog spaces are more encompassing research platforms where they could provide sort of wider parallel in situ experience and opportunities for this exposure to the onerous demands of an inhospitable environment directly. So the NASA NEMO program, which stands for the NASA Extreme Environment Mission Operations, is an analog mission which sends crews of astronauts, engineers, scientists, educators to live in the Aquarius habitat underwater for up to approximately 3 weeks at a time. This facility has just been acquired by Florida Institute of Technology last year, and we're hoping that there's ongoing support for the program. So much like space, the undersea world is hostile. It's an alien place for humans to live. So during NEMO missions, the aquanauts, who are astronauts training underwater for work in these types of extreme spaces, they're able to simulate living and working on a spacecraft, for instance, and to be able to also test their spacewalk techniques for future space missions. Now, this usually requires intensive preparation, planning, and sophisticated, often costly equipment. Now, in January of 2013, I led and designed the inaugural EVA simulation, and EVA stands for Extravehicular Activity or Spacewalk, workshop for graduate ISU students and faculty in Australia. It was a rudimentary but really effective installation. We used high-tech things like hula hoops as crude airlocks that the aquanauts or trainee astronauts had to translate and egress through. So the altered gravity conditions of the pool were utilised to introduce these trainee astronauts to a range of stresses while simulating a spacewalk and actually given the task or opportunity to perform with real live or so-called live feeds from a remote mission control. So the activities were broadcast using live video feeds. We used a handmade periscope, for instance, and the improvised low-tech, low-cost, high, messy kind of, but very effective bucket cam. And these surface crews were able to translate and direct their signals in this kind of relay time. I wouldn't use the term real time, it was kind of this relay time between the remote crews in a mission control and back to the divers underwater. So the participants were also observed and monitored. Their behaviour, their actions and their vital signs were monitored by the crews with these live feeds, and their actions were also time-stamped against kind of procedures and increments in relation to the decompression-related aspects, but also the technical aspects of trying to achieve their objectives. So it was a diverse international group of approximately 50 people over a 3-day period, including the Korean trainee astronaut and F-16 pilot, a young student engineers, a dancer, and we were very fortunate to have the European Space Agency astronauts Paolo Nespoli, who's flown in space twice, giving us on-site feedback and support of our activities. So while we didn't have an enormous budget or sophisticated equipment, we were able to successfully simulate and work through the real-life risks and responsibilities, highlighting things like the need for clear objectives, good communication, reliable technology and teamwork. How is this relating to art and design? Well, here I'll just move forward a little bit. But another project that inspires me is the current European Space Agency CAVES program, which stands for the Cooperative Adventure for Valuing and Exercising Human Behaviour and Performance Skills. It is another type of extreme training course. So in the bowels of the Earth, and in this case, the deep cave network of Sardinia, participants are introduced to a range of stresses of long-duration spaceflight, which can be simulated underground. For explorers of the deep, whether it's the deep ocean or deep underground, the risks are very real. The Sardinian caves are really isolated. There's not much connection with the outside world. There is the inherent risk of falling, getting lost, asphyxiation, contamination, and drowning. So setting up safe zones within these activities, the safe zones, for instance, for collecting water and emergency evacuation routes, are absolutely vital. And the astronauts need, in these situations, to get used to things like the confined space habitat, the minimal privacy, the technical challenges and the limited equipment and toolkits that they can take with them, and the basic supplies for hygiene and comfort, much the same that they would experience in space. So as extreme design and mission architects, what can we learn from this? We consciously or unconsciously prepare to continue or prepare for continued human exploration of outer space with the aim to maximise, firstly, human survivability, second, human performance, and thirdly, human thrivability, often in that order of priority. Now, in 2006, I had the privilege of leading a NASA-sponsored ISU project called Lunar Gaia, a closed-loop habitat for the Moon. This was a work chaired and commissioned by the NASA Ames Research Centre Director, and the work primarily focused on working towards an effective closed-loop system, looking at the biological system design, overlapping that which we have learned from both European, American, and other independent systems to see if we could increase the reliability of systems using this interdisciplinary and international approach. So we'll just guide you through the project here. This was, we looked at the mission architecture for a project supporting an optimal crew size of 13 people for an 18-month duration. We looked at issues such as crater selection, trying to optimize both areas of peaks of eternal light and peaks of eternal darkness so that we could work with heating issues, cooling systems. We redirected light, for instance, using an enormous array of mirrors to be able to filter water, to be able to heat systems. We introduced systems to the pre-existing biomass system. We introduced things like spirulina and tapioca into their systems, both as a food source and as a source of entertainment. We looked at the confined space habitats, the living and working spaces, and how we could maximize human health and well-being by integrating forms of entertainment with the life support systems themselves, using, say for instance, water filtration systems as screen-based interfaces for communications with family and friends back at Earth. So it was a wonderful thought experiment, which led to question, what would it be like if we're actually in a real life survival situation? And in picturing myself in these kinds of states, I began working on another project in parallel to try and explore some of these issues. Now, I work often as the only artist in art and science collaborations, but I also work with other artists, with other scientists and architects to actively or consciously design living studio spaces. And we deliberately set out to try and create a new type of experimental space and to disrupt the pre-existing, I guess, assumptions that we make in relation to those systems, both biological, technological, political, societal, and otherwise. This was a mobile performance art laboratory called Lifeboat. Obviously, it's housed and contained within the physical lifeboat itself, but it also talked about the work contained therein. I'm going to play you some of the performance aspects of the work which were relayed and broadcast out over the ocean to the audience and beyond.
Attention all life forms. This is a lifeboat announcement. In the interests of sentient comfort, the lifeboat crew would like to remind you that biological laboratories are a potential threat to administrative systems.
That wasn't me, by the way. You didn't recognise that voice at all. So we looked at the systems, we worked with audiences, international audiences, and we asked them to enter the lifeboat state with us. They needed to fill in a passport applications. We took photographs of them. We took samples of their DNA. We took fingerprints, and we got them to sign disclaimers. They all did that willingly. We also asked them to participate in a psychological profiling questionnaire. And of course, their data was then used to develop a musical output that would be directly related to their answers. The consequence of their musical output would in fact be related and directly correlated to the system of care or the aesthetics of care in looking after a form of life on board the vessel. And I'll just read you through the next step.
Upon obtaining visa clearance and passport approval, you will be assigned the responsibility of a life form on board the vessel. Your duty of care will be recorded and monitored as you undertake one of 10 roles in the life cycle of your assigned life form. These life forms may include the following in various states of existence or being: tissue explants and dissociated cells maintained in culture medium, plankton, seaweed, lifeboat crew member Pell, and an immature unidentified agent.
So I was lifeboat crew member Pell, and I didn't want anything to happen to me. And the small little life form was in fact Lilith, the baby that you see in there. So we really stretched the limits of what we thought was ethically possible within the parameters of this highly layered art and installation.
The lifeboat crew can track your progress using state-of-the-art tracking and surveillance systems. Visitors are ensured that our computerized QA64 response processing system, inclusive of cameras and microphones, will be with you every step of the way. Your progress will also be broadcast throughout the cruise ship opera and relayed to IZEA 04 conference headquarters in Helsinki.
So some of the questions
We thank you for the pleasure of your commitment to the cycle of life and look forward to processing you on this journey.
So it was most inviting. And look, some of the questions that we asked the participants were things, and I'll just give you one example. It was, you had 4 seconds in which to respond with either strongly agree, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. And there were questions like, or statements, such as, is Stalin a womanizer? All forms of life should be respected. Euthanasia is a viable alternative to other forms of, etc., etc. And so there were a number of instances where people didn't know how to respond, and they were in a situation where they were being monitored, they were being interrogated, if you like, to give a response, knowing that the outcome of their personal response would in fact have a consequence with a form of life. So as I started to play more and more with the idea of not only life forms but forms of life in extreme environments and the consequences of us manipulating life forms, whether it was living, semi-living, or partially semi-living, as I discovered existed, working with the Symbiotica Art and Science Laboratory, that it was about, I was looking at what it meant to manipulate life, and I was questioning as a performer what it meant to be putting myself in situations where I was in fact the subject of my own research. I was in fact the subject of my own personal live laboratory and experimental process. I proposed all sorts of theoretical outcomes as a way of questioning this and my motivations, including designing extraordinary things like a 3D type printer system where you could dial up online and use your own bodily system or your own biology to 3D print organs and literally kind of give birth to them to be able to self-generate or in fact help a friend in a terrible situation. But in real life, I was looking at forms of life from the ocean, and I was looking at relating myself to the kind of living systems and creatures that I was encountering. I'd started to work through this process or this body of research called aquabatics. And living and working underwater for long duration, I was aware that I was not only performing as a body in a body of water, that I was actually becoming one with my sense of performance in that space was of myself as a body within a body of water. And together in that unified, I guess, physical and psychological space, I could begin to perform and work. And that's something similar to this idea of this synergistic kind of relationship, this idea of a planet with a moon or an egg with a yolk. I began to sort of relate to a body of water in the same way. And similarly, I looked to myself at literally putting myself on the stage as a performer and what that meant in order to be able to discuss some of these really personal spaces and relationships in a public environment. Literally here in this performance, I was putting myself in a gel medium, setting myself in a life-size Petri dish, and working with a composer or a sound artist who had stuck hydrophones on my body so that once the actual medium had set, all that was audible to an audience were the kind of somatic cadence of my own body as I breathed and kind of made this gel squeak, if you like. But that's all you could hear, was this kind of the shape of this respiration in that space. So increasingly, as I look for inspiration from the world industries in underwater technology and, say, space and exploration, I understand more and more that a critical habitability consideration for these long-duration missions is the need to not only understand the specific consciousness of, say, zero or microgravity, but that this consciousness is a balance between the forces to affiliate and the forces to withdraw from both the inner and outer spaces therein. So an important question for me in terms of research and for other designers of these spaces, when you're talking about human factors, when you're talking about habitability, is just what this balance implies for living systems, particularly in space or subspace, and how is it recognized, and how is it communicated, and who is going to do that? So I've had a vision for a very long time of living and working underwater, and the reason I became a commercial diver is because I simply wanted a studio underwater, a space in which I could be inspired by the life surrounding me and work under pressure to create and inform a new type of artistic practice. It somehow snowballed from there. But I imagined traversing through spaces a little bit like being in a bubble under the ocean. Now, I didn't have the technologies in order to do that immediately, so I started to work on small performance aspects so that I could translate those ideas to the people who could support me and enable me to become part of wider projects. This is the Busselton Jetty on the west coast of Australia. And at the end of the jetty, there's an incredible underwater observatory and ripe marine life. Now, it may have been deceiving, but this is actually almost 2 kilometres long. This is the longest or largest wooden structure in the southern hemisphere. And the reason it is so long is that it has a little train line on it, is that this harbour or this bay is only approximately 8 metres deep. It's really shallow. So in order to get timber from the area and goods from the area out onto the vessels, they needed to create this extraordinarily long jetty. So I used this as my platform. I decided if I could move inside my own bubble and traverse along this enormous space from the land to an observatory, to a space where I could receive respite, I guess, from the ocean itself, that was one way of communicating the kind of journey that I was prepared to go on as a performance artist. I brought this work back into a gallery space and a museum space. And I started to talk about this idea of the fragile embodiment of a human being with a limited air supply, with a precious atmosphere, and being confined and restrained. So in this particular performance, I had approximately 16 minutes of air. I performed the work 5 times, in fact twice in the UK. And more than once, the technicians who were working on the production with me lost track of time. Yes. So I never passed out. But it got incredibly hot in there, and it really forced me in a way to, while my body was physically constrained, it was a beautiful transformative work. Once the condensation builds up, you can literally slip slide around that space. But as the condensation builds up and the oxygen depletes as well, this hemisphere, which is a freestanding hemisphere, begins to suction cap to the floor. And again, you get stickier and stickier. You get slipperier and slipperier. And it's like watching a fetus, I guess, inside a womb on an ultrasound. So I started to bring some of these ideas for living and working underwater to other types of events in freestanding tanks, and it was a bit disheartening in the sense that you really are restricted in a tank this size. I mean, look at my height, and these tanks would only come up to here, and trying to deal with buoyancy and apparatus and so on in these types of environments is really tricky, and it has nothing to do with the ocean or this idea of aquabatics and connecting with a natural environment. So I started to work with the frustration rather than avoid it, and really made a commitment to showing my vulnerability, showing my frustration, showing the limitation of my work, showing the hard work that was required to perform these types of activities for an audience. In much the same way that we see trainees for extreme environments documenting and working through all of the challenges and the realities of the environments in which they place their bodies, so that they can be envoys, so that they can report back, so that they can share with you the experiences of these extreme spaces. I also began to work with, I guess, developing my own forms of life support. I developed a rebreather system that I could use from the ocean to the land that mimics the biological function. So, for example, the scrubber was in the shape of a heart, and the bellows of the actual rebreather were in the shape of the lungs, and my so-called breathing space was cut off from the outside world. Could I in fact survive with this particular apparatus? No. It was what I'd call a scarf, or a kind of self-contained above water breathing apparatus failure, and I'm really grateful that I didn't perform with it underwater. But the design itself was reasonable. The problem was that I didn't system test it in the water first, and the system got too hot. Kind of condensation build-up, there was a risk of caustic soda, it wasn't very pleasant. So I worked on that, and I looked at what kind of apparatus would we require, and what could an artist do to sort of work with this techno-scientific understanding and this idea of live laboratory-style engineering to create a dual rebreather. In a survival situation, could we in fact work together with a figure of 8 type tether between two people in order to share air? And the politics of performing this work and constructing this work were really interesting and seemingly really confrontational for people. But the system was quite elegant, it was quite elegant in which to perform with. It was a very successful system actually, and we were able to demonstrate it for 12 hours, but we were rather fatigued by the end of it. Artists willingly or unwillingly experiment. It is a dynamic process. It creates movement, change, chance, and challenge to the status quo. Remember, you are all artists. It doesn't take many people or many resources to make a significant impact on the world. Think of that nameless guy who stood up to a tank in Tiananmen Square. Remember Mother Teresa and Julian Assange? Now we are all now, I guess, artists, researchers and divers now in this room. And we work together. Communication is essential. Whether it's through our disciplines or whether it's through our environments and our constructions. We need to speak with each other. We need to use it to our advantage and our mission. I'm also part of the Atlantica expedition, where finally I get to live and work underwater on a project. And while I'm not directly involved with the design of this habitat or its life support systems, I am working with a mixed international crew to be able to look at the type of performative actions that can occur in the water outside the habitat itself to increase and extend the type of experience that these inhabitants will have. This project is set to house 3 aquanauts full-time for a 90-day duration. The current record limit for a continual understay habitation is only 69 days, so this will be pushing new boundaries. But the whole purpose of it is to look and perfect and demonstrate certain technologies for longer duration living underwater. So obviously I will be involved with a group of artists actually, and I'll be one of approximately 24 aquanauts or divers, professionals, coming and going throughout the duration of the expedition in order to support the work of the 3 core people and to break up their day, quite literally, to ensure that they can stay there for that duration as well. So all of this began really simply. I'm asking myself, what kind of technology can I take with me into this space? I built a pair of Leonardo da Vinci wings based on his original design for flight underwater, and the results were a little bit like Icarus's ambition to reach the sun. I couldn't fly as I thought. The 2.25 metre spanned wings were incredibly difficult to propel. However, if I just relaxed and surrendered and put them back, the design was so ergodynamic that I could dive with incredible speed, so much so that it was almost difficult to pull out of it. Almost dangerous, in fact. But it got me thinking about human propulsion underwater. I'm interested in the kind of choreography and technology and how I can build devices and systems to support that. And I looked at a small freshwater creature called a tetrahemena. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. But when it's starved, it grows hair follicles, and it uses them to propel itself along in search of food. When it's found food, it brings them inside again and uses that for digesting the food source, and the cycle continues. And interestingly, it has 7 genders, which I don't quite understand. So I've been looking at this idea of creating systems for mapping human movement. And I created a little, a device for moving underwater and mimicking human motion. But I wanted to do more than that. I wanted it to be able to not only move or map my own movement, but the body of water surrounding it. And I use these really high-tech sketches to get the project off the ground. And I started to build prototypes using a prototype system for sensing the motion and then systems for being able to respond and mimic the motion. And I worked with programmers to design a game in which to be able to demonstrate this technology in shallow water. Again, using this idea of an interactive, playful interface. But I had to work on a system for making it propel, being able to move in 3 directions. And I went back to the idea of the tetrahemera, and I made silicon tentacles. And with the silicon tentacles, I can get multi-axial movement underwater. And of course, I can make them glow and light up. So my dream, my next venture, is to be able to map human movement underwater in a much more precise way, in a performative way. We have shallow water systems for tracking and mapping swimmers, people in shallow depths. I'm really interested in what happens at depth. And having lived and worked underwater for many years, there's a great deal to be learnt and there's a great deal to translate for designers in those spaces. So could I use my beautiful little, I'm calling them exploration fish, in homage to Frank White. Could I utilise them to map and mimic my own movement underwater and create a school of exploration fish that in fact dance with me underwater, showing my movement in these incredible spaces? So in closing, I'll just say that use your skills to advance your mission, your practice and your art. Bring forth your ideas of yesterday, of today, and imagine all that you are tomorrow to exceed the high expectations that the world places on us. I think this is a unique opportunity to experiment. In the face of sincere uncertainty, experiment, I dare you. Intensify your commitment to experiment. I dare you. Test everything, explore everything, play with everything, and build on your own intuition, build on your own passions to open up open source databases from the capacity of your own imagination to the hard realities of the environments and the times in which we live. From our representatives in government and cultural institutions to the legacies of our own ideas, our tools and artefacts, to what it means to be human, to what it means to be aquatic, to what it means to be robotic or otherwise. Experimentation unlocks possibility. It is a live testing process and it is vital for growth. Dive into new depths. Thank you.